Today we're asking the question, is this bike the perfect bike for use when we're out and about on our narrowboat? Although we have both got full-size electric bikes, we do find at times it can be a little bit tricky to take them with us when we go out on our narrowboat. They don't quite fit in that door without taking the front wheel off, and then once inside they take up a lot of room. So when we got a chance to try out the Fiido M1 Pro fat tyre folding electric bike, we couldn't resist that opportunity. Being a folding bike means it eliminates any storage issues straight away. We can actually fold this up and it'll sit in our shower tray out the way until we need it, or until we need a shower obviously. And having those fat tyres is perfect for the muddy tracks and the towpaths that we regularly ride on whilst out and about on our boat. The bike arrived very well packaged from Fiido and it was already partially assembled. Just needed a few last bits putting together. Things like the front wheel putting on, handlebars, mud guards. It arrived extremely well packaged from Fiido and it was already largely assembled. Just needed the last few bits putting on, like the handlebars, the front wheel and things like the mud guards. But once I'd got it put together, I decided to put it straight to the test and used it for my commute to work. To work is just under 8 miles, which I can normally do in sort of 30-35 minutes without any real strain. There's no major hills on this actual ride either, and I'd expect this 500 watt motor to cope perfectly well and drag me up them as and when required. The ride itself is sort of about 50% on the roads and 50% on the cycleways such as I'm on at the moment. With being a folding bike, obviously that means it's not got things like pannier racks and stuff like that. So it does mean I've had to bring my rucksack. I need my sandwiches for later on. It's not the best when you have to ride with a rucksack on. It is far better if you can get stuff onto pannier racks and in bags and things like that. But like I say, that's kind of the compromise you have to make when you're wanting that folding bike and you're wanting to keep the size small and compact. If you start sticking things like panniers on the back, it defeats the object. I think one of the key things you have to look at when considering riding to work on a bike is what state are you going to be in when you get there. Because last thing you want to do is turn up to a day's work stinking of sweat, all smelly, out of breath, taking your first hour at work to get yourself back together. Something like this is obviously taking all the strain out of that pedalling. So I shouldn't end up sweaty and smelly, and I shouldn't be getting to work puffing and blowing, unable to do my job for the first hour. On some of these nice open road sections, I am just testing this throttle, and in effect it's kind of cruise control. So I've got the bike up to sort of 40 kilometers an hour, and then I can take my thumb off the throttle and it's just more or less holding me there at that speed, and that comfortably keeps me up with the flow of traffic in sort of a city or town centre. And at that, obviously, I'm not even having to pedal at all, but that does have its own consequences, as we discussed in the video about the use of a throttle on an electric bike here in the UK. Well, that's phase one done. We're now basically at work. It's got me here, not a problem. One of my colleagues at work has owned an electric bike for a couple of years now. So during his lunch break, he decided to take the Fiido for a spin. And just up the road from our work is a little cycle track on the local park. So where better to test it? Although the bike that he's got cost about 3 times the price of this one, he was very impressed with it. He liked how much power it had got and the way it rides, especially in those off-road situations. And we're off. Then when the day's work was done, it was back on the bike to head off home. And the ride back was pretty straightforward. I logged the journey using the Strava app on my phone. It gave the return journey as taking just under 30 minutes, covering a total distance of 8.1 miles. Bearing in mind that during rush hour, this journey by car usually takes 35 to 40 minutes. So using the bike makes a reasonable saving on time. The Fiido M1 Pro has a 48 volt 12.8 amp hour battery, giving a theoretical maximum range of 130 kilometers. In the real world, you're never going to actually achieve that theoretical maximum range, but even so, it still means I could do this journey a fair few times before having to recharge the battery. There's plenty of adjustment on the saddle height, meaning that anyone from around 5 foot to 6 foot 5 inches tall can safely ride this bike. With the battery fitted, it weighs just over 25 kilograms and has a maximum payload of 120 kilograms. As well as that commute to work, in the time that we've had this Fiido M1 Pro, we found it's come in really handy. Because we live on a narrowboat, we don't actually have a full postal address for deliveries. And we recently needed some new blades for our chainsaw. So I ordered those through Amazon and they were dropped off to the local Amazon parcel locker. I simply nipped out on the Fiido and got the items we needed. It's also very handy for when those emergencies crop up. You know, when you need a chocolate bar or a pint of milk so you can make yourself a brew. So let's sum up by looking at the good points and the not so good points that we've found with the Fiido M1 Pro fat tyre electric folding bike. The first good point is probably an obvious one and a no-brainer really. It's really easy to store. Simply folds in half and the handlebars drop down so it barely takes up any space and you can keep it out the way, just bringing it out when you need it. The 500 watt motor provides plenty of power. It'll get you up all those hills and take you on most rides that you'd want to go on. That's obviously assisted by the 48 volt battery. Again, that's providing plenty of power and giving the theoretical range of up to 130 kilometres. That's more than ample for most people's journeys. When it arrived, it was virtually fully built, just a few parts needed putting on, all of which went together very simply. Overall, it seems to be very solidly built, and I do like these rugged looks. The bike is quite high geared. That front cog there is quite large, but it's matched to a nice 7-speed Shimano gear set, and it has a nice smooth gear change, going up and down the gears no problem. Being high geared is not such an issue because of it being electric drive. You've got that assistance there helping you with that motor and the battery when it's needed. If it was simply a bike to ride of its own accord, I think it may be a little bit too high geared. But like I say, with that assistance, it's perfectly fine as it is. The front and rear disc brakes do a more than adequate job. They are mechanical disc brakes, and if you wanted any more braking power, you're then really looking at needing hydraulic brakes, and for that, you're clearly moving up the price range. The front suspension does exactly what it's supposed to do. Takes out those initial bumps and lumps in the road or the towpath, keeping the ride as smooth as possible. I'm not entirely convinced this rear shock absorber does a great deal at all, to be honest. I think that's there more as a gimmick than an actual usable suspension component. I do now have to look at one of the big downsides to this bike, and as mentioned in that ride to work, it does have a throttle on it, which makes riding really simple. But when you look at the current UK laws for riding push bikes, anything that's got a throttle or can go at over 15.5 miles an hour is technically illegal in this country. To have an electric bike that complies with the current UK legislation, it should only be pedal assisted, which means that motor's only kicking in whilst you're turning the pedals, not whilst using a throttle. And it shouldn't be able to go above 15.5 miles an hour whilst using that power. Therefore, if you are planning to use it on public roads and paths here in the UK, you do need to give it some serious thought as to whether you're happy with that situation. The saddle on this bike is not the most comfortable saddle I've ever sat on. It's quite narrow and it's also very firm. I do appreciate when you're building a folding bike, you need to keep everything tight and compact. But I do think that there was perhaps the element of making the saddle that bit wider and a bit comfier, as in essence this is a commuting bike, it's not a racing bike. Since getting this bike, I would estimate I've done a couple of 100 miles on it to test it, check it and see what I think to it. And it has just thrown up a couple of niggles. Nothing major, but they are niggles nonetheless. First of all, this stand, the little end caps come off at some stage, so it's now just a metal end rather than a nice rubber foot that sits onto the ground. At one point I did get a puncture in this rear tyre. You can't help getting a puncture, it happens to all bikes. The slight niggle with that though is, because this has got these 4-inch wide, 20-inch diameter tyres, they're not a standard size, and none of the local bike shops had got an inner tube suitable for this bike in stock. So I had to order one online, which meant waiting a couple of days until it arrived. The battery for the bike is concealed inside that frame there, and you can normally charge that battery whilst it is in the frame. The only thing was, a couple of days ago I got the charger and I went to plug the jack into the socket, and the socket was kind of moving out the way, it seemed. So I opened the frame up, slid the battery out, and I found that the actual socket holder had snapped. So that meant as I was trying to plug the jack point in, it was just pushing the socket out the way. What I've done to rectify that is I just charged the battery up on the bench in the boat, because you can hold the jack plug in the right place to get into the socket. It now does just mean though that I'm not going to be able to charge that battery up whilst it's in the bike at any time. As such, it's not really a major issue, because most of the time I will be taking the battery out to charge separately from the bike while that's stored away. Overall then, I'm finding it quite a fun bike to ride. I've used it on the road and on towpaths, muddy tracks, the bike track, etc. And overall it's holding up extremely well to everything that I'm throwing at it. I would say obviously it's probably not a bike that you would choose to do a long distance bike ride on. Things like the normal mountain bikes or road bikes are ideal for that. This is something that you can throw in the back of your car, put in your caravan or your camper van, or even in your boat, and it gives you something that you can use when you're out and about. Hopefully then you found this an informative video, and it's given you some information that you might require about the Fiido M1 Pro fat tyre electric folding bike. If you've got any specific questions about the bike or the Fiido brand in general, please pop those in the comment section below, and I'll do my best to answer them, or get someone from Fiido to answer them for you. Thanks for watching then. Cheerio.